Hi everyone, thank you for watching. Please subscribe to the channel, I really appreciate it. Thank you. So another person important in Trump's cabinet in the sense of what I'm trying to do in recent videos, showing patterns that repeat, people whose planets reveal pressures at different points. And in the case of Kristy Noem, what we see is already she's had significant pressure, and by all accounts, she is not popular with the public at large, especially with the voters that vote Democratic. But even overall, despite carrying out what apparently many in the Republican base want to see done, the overall approach isn't landing very well, and this you would connect to her Mercury at near the 28th degree of Sagittarius, which has had Saturn pressure already earlier this year and will have more pressure again. So this is the first signal where you know that it's pretty immediate. You might be hearing problems with her job and what she's doing and what is happening anytime, like meaning end of this month, next month, because that Mercury is being hit, and then the Saturn goes to the 25th degree of Pisces, does the square pretty close to that Mercury. So basically from right around now all the way into the early part of next year, there is already pressure on that account. The fact that that Mercury is being challenged mostly by Saturn, a little bit by Neptune, in that Neptune is very late in Pisces. You can add a little bit of that as well in the winter, so two big planets putting pressure on the Mercury. But then what happens is the Saturn then goes into Aries in 2026 in February, whereupon it'll cross through that Venus, although that's pretty quick. It goes through there in the March period, then it moves beyond it. However, she's by no means free of it, because as it goes toward the middle of the year, then it conjoins the natal Eris, and that can be enough to signify continued pressure. All you need is one planet with Saturn for it to connect to, and there you are. Eris is a notorious chaos agent, discordant agent, so Saturn going through there can be quite problematic. I didn't mention too that the Venus is also involved in a square to Pluto at birth. That does complicate it, meaning in the March period something really challenging could happen in there, because Saturn will be in early Libra opposing Pluto squaring Venus. And when you have an aspect like that at birth, it is definitely possible something could happen that is really challenging. And then if you look at 2026, the other problem she has is that even though the Saturn goes through the Venus, does land on Eris, which is enough to create pressure, but if you put a planet like Venus also in the 11th degree, that would have been really magnified. However, in a way, you don't need to move Venus to the 11th degree, because Neptune next year will square that Venus all year. And her Neptune at birth, you can see it opposing Saturn really directly. So that planet is loaded for trouble. It's loaded to bring in confusing energies, complicated energies, energies of loss of popularity. Neptune is a celebrity planet on the high end. You can be really famous and be adored by many people. If the Neptune goes sour on you, then the opposite happens. People dislike you a lot. And so that is not a good situation in 2026. And if someone were to say, well, yeah, but look, I mean, Saturn in Aries at least is trining in the direction of her Sun, and even her Jupiter in mid-year, that should be good. Theoretically, yes. In practice, though, whenever you see a planet at birth, like her Saturn, opposing Neptune in the sun, that planet carries that energy in its cycles. So when it's making an angle later to anything, including in trine or in sextile, which are supposed to be helpful, but I've seen this many times where planets like that either produce more neutral effects where they don't really help you, or they can actually do damage through the trine. That's a little more rare, but the point being that it's not particularly helpful in a way of saving you from the problems that are happening in the chart elsewhere. So bottom line, she definitely qualifies as one of the many in the cabinet that reflect difficult 2026 conditions, which, if we're looking at this from the thesis of the election in 2026 and the Democrats regaining the House and possibly the Senate, you need more and more of these charts to show difficult conditions because, as I've said already a number of times, if the election switches governance, even just with the House, all these cabinet people, or nearly all, would be facing a lot more pressure through congressional investigations. Basically, they would find themselves under what we'll call tough times. Now, turning now to Kash Patel, seen here in his characteristic deer in the headlights stare, probably also reflecting he doesn't know what's happening whenever it is. But in any case, when you look at the chart, you see, again, definite patterns that point to a complicated 2026, and biggest would have to be that he has that Mars Eris conjunction in Aries opposite Pluto, and Saturn will reach the Eris in a station in the middle of the year, and so effectively it'll be playing out of those degrees going into 2027, which of course immediately makes it difficult. Eris can be discordant, chaotic, problematic. But then, to add to that, is the fact that this being a day chart without a time, so I don't know where the moon is, but I know it's between 2 1/3 degrees of Cancer and then 14, almost 15 degrees of Cancer, so it's somewhere in there. And the odds are pretty good that the Saturn will find it next year. Now, if he's born really, really early, like 1 o'clock in the morning, midnight, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, then it would be much earlier. That would reflect the troubles he's already had. He's already had some because he's definitely stepped in it a few times. But the more he's born toward noon and later, the more 2026 becomes even more problematic as a result. And to this, you can add that he has Saturn at 25 degrees Virgo, which means the transiting Saturn will oppose it in November and December too, and to some extent next month, but the really intense month is November. And so that already signals upcoming pressures. And with these people, you always have to be thinking that on the one hand, Trump wants to keep them all because they're very loyal. Only the best people, but really it's only the loyal people. Incompetence doesn't matter, and this is what we're constantly seeing, that on top of being odious, they're also often highly incompetent. And this guy's the head of the FBI, which is pretty scary. So Saturn opposing could be enough to create those kinds of pressures that could get him fired, but at minimum, it makes the situation more difficult. And then, going into next year, he deals with the Saturn. If the moon happens to be, the later it is in the day, the more complicated it is. And even without that, he definitely qualifies, not as much as the previous chart that I just did, but nevertheless, more than enough to qualify as one of the people that find 2026 stressful and therefore put the election in peril.